Okay. Well, I think we will go ahead and get started. So again, my name is John Barr. I'm with the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. I want to thank you all for your interest and participation today. This session is on what we call like Workforce Grants 101. Some others might call it GATA or other requirements under the Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, or GATA. Today, we're going to go through what we're calling the pre-award activities, and that includes all of the activities that you as a grant applicant are going through to consider submitting an application. This session is focused around the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act programs, but we've provided this presentation for many other workforce programs because the administrative requirements and the process and procedures for submitting a grant to the state of Illinois are somewhat consistent across DCEO and other agencies, and that's really the whole point of the grant, the GATA legislation, really is to standardize activities, but we'll talk about that in a second. So we are going to be focused again on this the pre-award phase. Once your applications are or if they are awarded, there's a whole other set of process and procedures that we'll work with you on as you administer your projects. So again, the Grant Accountability Transparency Act, the whole idea is to increase accountability for state funds. The biggest impact is that it is utilizing the federal grant management standards for any state-funded grant. So it doesn't matter if it's federal or state-funded, like we have the same administrative rules of engagement. And sometimes those can be frustrated because there's additional processes and procedures that, if your organization, perhaps you had a grant with the state 10 years ago, perhaps, there are some things that, you didn't have to, provide. But as we all know, the world kind of evolves, as well as the complexity of the programs and the accounting of funds, and the whole idea here around the Grant Accountability Transparency Act is to be more accountable for the taxpayer funds, and also advantages to grantees. So you can have some more consistency across programs within the department, across the agencies. So just a little bit of background as to the why we're requiring many of the processes and procedures that we do require. So part of the process, and this is true again for DCO and other agencies. So again, if this is the first time, if this is the first state application that your organization is considering, this is good information for you because it should be somewhat consistent across different agencies as well. So, the more you hear it, the more you'll know it, and the more prepared you'll be for applications and making that process as efficient as possible. So part of the overarching timeline or process of getting ready for an award is that you as a grantee have to go through a registration process. You as an organization have to be pre-qualified with the state of Illinois. You have to go through a risk assessment. We're going to talk about all these. That includes both an administrative risk assessment and a program risk assessment. And then there's some disclosures and conflicts of interest, right? So most of this is standardized, again, across agencies and programs. There's also within the state requirements, the state and federal for that matter, there is what's called an indirect cost rate. And so many people will equate indirect costs with administrative costs. From a technical standpoint, that's not exactly true, but big picture standpoint, it is. It's basically, these are the costs that you really can't attribute to one specific program or activity. It's kind of like that overhead bucket where things go into, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. There is within the state of Illinois a whole system of registering yourself as an organization, and part of that process, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, is to tell us about you as an organization, and then also to determine how do you want to handle those kind of overhead and indirect costs. So the state does have a portal for its grantees. It's called the Illinois Grant Accountability and Transparency Act Grantee Portal. And I'm going to show you what that looks like, and there's a couple of slides that will also go into that. But again, there's a whole registration process, and that includes the indirect cost. So first and foremost, all grantees have to register with the state using a illinois.gov ID, and that's kind of step one. Just like these days, you have to register with everything. You have to, create and validate who you are, right? Once I should say the grantee registration is completed by going to grants.illinois.gov and associating your illinois.gov account with your organization. Completing the registration then will trigger the pre-qualification verifications. And so I can just show you quickly here what that portal looks like. So if you go to grants.illinois.gov, hopefully I'm showing that screen. Let me just move that over. So let me try this again just to verify. Okay, great. So hopefully you are now seeing that this is the grants.illinois.gov, and so this is where you would go to create an account and also to sign in. So just so you have that awareness. So going back then to the presentation. All right. So once you get yourself set up, then you go through a pre-qualification process, right? And so the GATA rules and the uniform guidance, again, the federal regulations, right? They talk about all of the things, all of the requirements of grantees as an organization, as a grant applicant, right? So you should have what's called a sam.gov account. You need to have a federal unique identifier number. Your organization has to be in good standing with the Secretary of State as applicable. You have to make sure that you're not on an excluded parties list, and that would happen if you had a federal award and something went very wrong, and you were basically put on a kind of a flagged list of for noncompliance or other issues. And then you can't be on the Illinois Stop Payment List. Again, similar situation if you had a state grant and something there were some issues there, the state will flag your organization to make sure that other agencies don't issue additional funds until those issues are addressed. And then obviously also not on the HS provider sanction list. So all this again is to help increase our accountability as an agency, to the taxpayers, making sure that your organizations are up to date with all of their requirements. It's important to note that your registrations into this GATA portal must be done at the point of application, okay? So if you have not done this yet and you're planning to submit either the Navigator or the Workforce Hub program applications, again, you've got a little time, but not much. I would today connect with your chief fiscal officer or the person who has that responsibility. Do that today and start the registration process, or make that connection to get it done next week. Sometimes it takes a while to complete some of these other requirements, and you don't want to be sitting out there at the last minute and trying to get your GATA registration complete, because that unfortunately is a non-starter for us. If you're not pre-qualified at the point of registration, that's going to be an issue for us as it relates to accepting your application, okay? So if there are no issues, right, once you complete that process, great, you're qualified. If there are issues, it will send emails to that person who registered. And that's where I said, really talk to your chief financial person, because they would be the one that would receive automated messages from the state of Illinois GATA portal, right? So they're going to get messages basically from the point that you registered moving forward, right? So if you intend to have grants with the state of Illinois, they will send you periodic messages at a minimum on an annual basis for you to update your information and get pre-qualified. It is important to note that this whole pre-qualification process, it is an annual process, and so we'll ask the system, requires you to go in and tell the state about your entity. We know that things change, staff change, and we require you to go in and help us make an assessment of your organization. So with that, the system will automatically send you some information about any pre-qualification issues, and that would go to the person who registered, right?
So John, can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
We have got a lot of applicant teams where there's multiple partners on a team. Could you please address whether all the team members need to be pre-qualified or just the main grantee?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so the answer is just the grantee, right? So from a grant management perspective, the state of Illinois is primarily concerned with the organization who is the lead entity who would receive the grant funds and would enter into a grant agreement with the state of Illinois. They are legally obligated or bound, right, by all the terms and conditions. And the way that the state sees this, right, is that, let's say that the person who applies is that organization, they apply, they have, let's say, 4 partners, right? All 4 of those partners are still required to meet all of those terms and conditions of the agreement, but they are bound to the lead organization, right? So the state technically does not have a direct relationship with all of your partners. We count on the lead organization to oversee all of the partners and make sure that they're doing everything that they're supposed to do and meeting all of those requirements. So that it's a responsibility, right? So not only do you have to do all the administrative work with the state, but you have to also oversee all of your partners and subs. So the good thing is just from a application standpoint, let's say you have 4 partners, right? All 4 of those partners don't have to be pre-qualified under GATA. So that means like it gives some projects and project partners a little bit of a leg up, right? Because if you have an approach of, we have a lead organization who's done grants, quite a bit, and they have a staff who've done this, and they know the requirements, and they know what how it works. And maybe you have some new nonprofits that's going to help with some of the outreach, and maybe some others that are going to do the case management, right? You can go under this kind of umbrella where those smaller, not smaller, but those partners that may be only concerned with one component of the project, they don't have to come in and worry about all of the administrative work and the reporting, but they do have to listen to that lead partner. So that when that lead partner says, well, we need X, Y, and Z information, they've got to provide it because they're legally bound to provide it and make sure that everybody is playing by the rules of the grant agreement. But again, you don't have to be pre-qualified. Those 4 partners do not have to be pre-qualified. Any other questions at this point? It's a good question. All right, so I kind of alluded to the information on this slide about how that annual, you have to go through kind of like that annual process of telling the state about yourself. And what's that's called a fiscal risk assessment, or internal control questionnaire is the technical term to it, right? And so you answer a number of multiple choice questions about your organization, and then the state sends it through a scoring process where it identifies the level of risk that your organization might have, and it's based on formal fiscal, administrative, audit policies and procedures and controls that the whole point is to predict whether or not you will be able to meet all of the significant requirements of a grant agreement, and we'll go through some of those later in the presentation. Also, part of our risk assessment and risk management is going through a program risk assessment. This process is changing a little bit. It used to be that it was, again, another kind of multiple choice process. We're evolving, or the regulations have evolved a little bit on this, and we'll follow up with those applicants that pass the merit review process and go to the grant negotiation stage. That's when we'll focus more on the program risk assessment. So at this point, again, you might want to make a note: program risk assessment, don't worry about until grant negotiation. Fiscal risk assessment, or the internal control questionnaire, make a note, very important, must be done every year, okay? And so the state will determine kind of risk profiles based on the fiscal and the programmatic risk. And programmatic risk is basically taking a look at a lot of what you had to say in your application, right? We talk about, what is your organization's capacity? Who are the people that are going to be assigned to this project, right? And so that's your opportunity to really, demonstrate to the merit review team and the state grant managers who would negotiate the grant that you have an experienced project team that, the more experience you have, generally speaking, the less risk you might have from your ability, frankly, to pull the project off, right? So that's the idea there. Okay, so the second piece of your registration is identifying your indirect cost rates. So each grantee or each organization has to select an indirect cost rate option, and that's again in that GATA portal, right? So the definition of this is: indirect cost is a device used for determining, funds that can't be directly identified to a specific program. There are a number of options for indirect costs. You could, if your organization has a negotiated rate with the federal government, you could use that. If your organization has a rate that's negotiated with the state, you could use that. Or you could simply use a 10%, what's called a 10% de minimis rate, or elect not to request any administrative costs. I think the key here is not to get too hung up around indirect costs. Your fiscal folks should have a thoughtful conversation or complete a thoughtful analysis around indirect costs and what is most appropriate for their organization. I would say the majority of new grantees utilize this 10% de minimis rate, or choose not to collect any indirect or overhead costs. They directly charge the activities to the grant, which is allowable. So again, indirect is definitely an area where a lot of new applicants can get confused, and because it is confusing, I will tell you at the end of this slide deck there's some resources for you to consider. I actually have a whole other training presentation around indirect costs and the calculation of indirect costs. So we're not going to dig too deep into that, but just know that it's important. But at the end of the day, I would say for these two applications, for the CJIP program especially, right? I mean, and for many other workforce programs, I would say that your correct calculation of the indirect costs on your budget is not going to make or break your application. So this is one of those details that if your project is moved to the negotiation stage, we will have to button up for sure. But again, as a new applicant, it should go probably in the medium to lower end of your worry list. All right, so I am going to talk just a little bit about that. And again, here are some of those resources. We talked about kind of our ability to work with you. I mean, that's basically what this slide says, is that we're going to work with you if your grant gets past the merit review stage. We're going to work with you to make sure that this is done correctly. If your organization is interested in doing a lot with the state and you're kind of new to grants, I would definitely dig into it. Go through a 101, 201, 301, become a master of indirect, because it's going to be important to your organization to apply that consistently and to understand, all the components. All right. So moving now to just some of the required administrative documents. We've kind of gone through the whole registration process, right? You're telling us, you're telling the state, not only DCO, again, once you register with the state, you could identify other funding opportunities. And I showed you that grantee portal. And one of the things, or one of the features on that, is that there is what they call a catalog of state financial assistance, right? So it's a list of every grant opportunity, or what the state calls Notice of Funding Opportunities, NOFOs, right? Listing of all of those grant opportunities, and that's updated. So again, if your organization is, new or now interested more with state funding opportunities, that's a resource where I would definitely encourage you to check out for different types of opportunities. And that again, that website is listed there. So we follow these formalized process. That's why you see that, our funding opportunities back in the day, maybe they were 10 pages or so. Well, now they're much more detailed. And one of the reasons for that is so that we are consistent, and includes, many of the kind of the boilerplate requirements and notices to you as a potential grantee or potential applicant, right? So we follow the NOFO, and I'm going to show you what that looks like as we go through the process. We also, for every grant in the state, right, there is required a uniform application for grant assistance. We utilize a uniform budget template. And once we, again, if your project passes through the merit review stage, and again, I'm talking about merit review, you know, basically that's your evaluation committee that is scoring your applications against the criteria that are listed in the NOFO. Okay, so if your grant is meets the minimum threshold and is the highest scored, or depending on whatever the methodology of that NOFO is, then you'll move on to kind of that grant negotiations, and the state will send you more information. And the goal at the end of all of this is to get a notice of state award, and that's your agreement with us. All right, so this is very important. I would probably, if probably one of the most important slides of the presentation, because it's a quick checklist of everything that you must submit with your application. Okay. Now, uniform guidance is fairly detailed around, procedures to ensure fairness across grantees. And the departments, the different agencies have some discretion around, accepting applications that are incomplete. But let me tell you, if you do not include every single element that is required in the NOFO, then you are putting yourselves at risk of getting thrown out at the administrative review. So that means that your project, all that work that you did, unfortunately, you wouldn't be scored. And that's a GATA rule. And so we don't like, as a program manager, I don't like it. I'll tell you straight out, I don't like it. But those are the GATA regs. So again, the key is to make sure your application is complete. I think this is so important that I do want to just pause here, and I want to go and just show you the notice of funding opportunity. Let's look at the Workforce Network Program notice of funding opportunity here, and so this is kind of the guts of what we've asked for, right? So hopefully this looks familiar to you, right? So again, this is a 37 pages standard format of kind of background about the program, provide some definitions that you should absolutely utilize in your program design, talks about some of the program requirements and the required elements. Again, all this background information is very important when we get to, and I'm sorry if I'm making you dizzy, but I do want to just kind of show you how all of these elements build to the bottom line list of what is required. So just give me a moment here. Okay, here it is. So if you look at this again, for both the network NOFO as well as the Navigator NOFO, Part D is going to be a key place to look at, and it corresponds to that slide that I showed you, right? So what is the content that is required for submission, right? Notice that it says standard application package must include the following items, right? So your standard application, I'll show you that in a second. Your budget, uniform budget using our template, conflict of interest, mandatory disclosures, an executive summary, your technical proposal. And again, back in the day, 10 years ago, this was your meat and potatoes of your submission, right? This is where you tell us who you are, who you're going to serve, what project, what are you going to do, and what are the outcomes going to be, right? This is the key, like this is the key information. This also important, but more kind of standardized administrative documents, right? So again, technical proposal. And at the end of the technical proposal, so you can see all this technical proposals goes, directly back to the background information. So if you want to know, what can you do to be competitive in your technical application, go to the front, look at the background information and the program requirements. And then finally, speaking of requirements, is the attachments. So attachment 1, project work plan; 2, participant outcome summary; 3, curriculum; 4, staffing plan. Okay, so key point in the NOFO, or in the notice of funding opportunity, again, going back to section D2, application submission information and requirements, right? So definitely pay attention to that. Make sure that you have that information, that it's identifiable. You can package this information together as like kind of one PDF or multiple PDFs. I've seen that before, where maybe these documents, the uniform app, the budget, and even the conflicts and the disclosures are, you have 5 different physical files, right? But then maybe the executive summary and the technical proposal are lumped together in the sixth file, and then you lump together all of your attachments as one PDF file. Attachment 1 through 4 are lumped together, so you have a total of 6 to 8 actual files that you submit to us. So that is what is required. So any questions about that? I want to pause just because it's so important. Okay. Well, I will then keep going then. These next couple of slides here just talk about some of the things that you should consider, your teams should consider, right? I talked about utilizing all of the information that is listed within the notice of funding opportunity, utilizing all the background, utilizing your knowledge of the authorizing legislation. That's all important, right? And it informs what we are asking for you as an applicant to provide us, right? And so definitely respond with your technical proposal with that in mind. And so the technical proposal is directly, or I should say the components of the technical proposal are directly related to the merit review team criteria, okay? So typically we have an applicant capacity section, and we ask you questions about who you are and what your team looks like for the project. We have that in the technical narrative. So we have probably a dozen questions in the technical narrative. And then you can also see in the NOFO, there are criteria that are associated with applicant capacity. There's a direct correlation between the technical questions that we ask in your narrative proposal to the evaluation criteria under applicant capacity. So again, this slide is just some pretty general things to consider when you look at applicant capacity in addition to the information in the legislation and the NOFO, okay? Documentation of need, that's the next criteria. Again, target populations, what are the needs, How can you verify? Can you give us statistics that are validated? Can you verify statements that you are making with facts and updated information that is customized to your proposal? Again, things to make your proposal as competitive as it can be. Operational plan. What is your approach? Is it feasible? Does it pass the kind of the feasibility test, right? You're going to say you're going to, in the background section, if your organization has typically served 100 people a year, and you're going to then through this project serve 1,000 people a year 10 times without clearly this a clear plan that shows how you're going to scale up your operation, that's going to be an issue, right? It's going to show some operational and capacity concerns. So again, it's got to be reasonable and paint the entire picture, because the merit review team only look at the information that you provide us. And then finally, it's the budget and the return on investment. And so we're going to go through the uniform budget template, but I want to just mention that the state has requested information in the technical proposal, a narrative, right? So you can outline what are your costs, what are your costs per participant, what are the activities, what does the budget look like, right? We know that the budget spreadsheet that I'm going to show you is very complicated, and we don't want you to get hung up around that complexity. So just I guess a recommendation for your evaluation teams is to take this section of your narrative proposal seriously, and complete the information and the questions, and be complete in your responses. And that's true for all of the sections, I should say. If there is a question in an element, make sure that you answer that completely. All right, so I'm going to start by just kind of walking through so you can see some of these different forms. Again, we talked about how important it is to make sure that you have a complete application, right? And so this uniform for state grant assistance, it talks about who you are. So there's there's an agency information, kind of the background, and then there's a part of this form where you complete it. And then you have to have somebody who's authorized to, sign it, right? So this form looks like this. Okay, so I always kind of equate this uniform application for state grant assistance. I guess on the face, it's like, somebody, if they came from Mars and said, oh, this is all I have to do to get, millions of dollars, great. How do I complete it? Well, this is really just a cover sheet for all intensive purposes, right? Because you have your technical proposals and all the other attachments. But this is essentially a cover sheet. It's very formalized and meets all of those great GATA requirements. And so it talks and it provides your accounting folks with, the listing of the state financial assistance number, and just kind of documents from an accounting standpoint where all this money is coming from. And so this top part is, I apologize, this top part is completed by the agency, so page 1 and part of 2, and then you'll see applicant completed sections. There you go. That's where you start to go. And so complete all that. And then moving to the next slide. I apologize if I'm making anyone dizzy. So the uniform budget template, again, this one is, if you've never done one of these before, it's a bit of a beast. we are here to help you, especially organizations that pass the merit review and are going to go through the negotiation process. So know that we will not disqualify or discount your application because there is a technical issue in your uniform grant budget. But it is important. There are some things that, so if you don't submit it, then your application would get thrown out. You wouldn't get past the administrative review. So I don't want to diminish the importance of this because you have to do it, right? But you have to do it to the best of your ability. And if there's a technical issue with, misclassifying a cost in one line item or another, we're not gonna throw you out. So let me just show you what that looks like. So this is the uniform budget template, and a couple of things. There's the first tab here is just kind of some of the instructions. If you've never done one of these before, I would definitely go through the instructions. Section A is a summary of all of the allowable budget line items, okay? So you may say, okay, well, I'm going to ask for $100,000 in personnel, and look what happens if you start trying to type. You'll get that message that says, no, you can't type there because it's protected, right? So that's part of the tricky thing here, is that this Section A tab, right, all the tabs at the bottom of the workbook, Section A tab is a summary of the information that you list in these other budget tabs, right? So you'll see here, and I apologize that it's not very large, but I'll try to zoom in a little bit here. You'll see these are the budget lines, right? You got personnel, you got fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, right? You see that there is a number 1A, 2A, 3, 4, 5, right? So on and so forth. It all corresponds, so 1A corresponds to personnel. 2A corresponds to fringe benefits. So if you start typing in, Jane manager, and then exec director, and wage year, for 3 years, or let's just call it a year. I don't think she's. I'll take that salary. Not going to happen. No. Okay, so you'll see you enter the information here. You're also able to insert, additional columns. So if you need additional columns to list all of your personnel, you can do that. And then that information will show up here on the cover sheet, right? So bottom line, you enter in your costs, the detailed costs for each of the budget line items utilizing this data entry. Now, also important, so you list those costs, right? So you list every staff person, the amount of time that they're going to be focused on the project. Also within each line or each budget line item, there is a narrative section that you have to complete, right? So in addition to your technical narrative, where we ask you to provide us with the high level overview of your costs and costs and buckets of costs, this is where we're getting into more granular detail, right? And so for each budget line item that you have a cost proposed, you have to provide a narrative where our accounting folks can see, oh, okay, yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, but again, a sample narrative here may be Jane manager is responsible for all the program oversight and will be responsible for 100% of their time to the CJA Workforce Network Hub project, whatever it is, right? So again, similar thing, so if Jane Manager was gonna, travel, and, you can put in, mileage, you can put in trip estimates. There's other lines for supplies, consultant costs, occupancy costs, telecom. Training and education, I would point out training and education is more focused for your internal staff and partner professional development, right? So it's not meant for the training of your workers, or I should say your participants, right? So the people you're trying to get into the clean energy jobs, right? It's not meant for them. It's really meant for training your internal staff, professional development, even partner development opportunities throughout the life of the grant. There's this direct administration costs. So, again, so how does this differ from indirect costs? Well, the answer is, if indirect, you really can't attribute it to one program or another. But let's say that you had an accountant that was directly, all they were doing was CEJA, or you can definitely, count their hours directly back to the CEJA project. You could charge it in this direct administrative line. The key, though, is that you can't double dip your direct administrative and your indirect costs. Okay, so I know I'm going a little bit into the weeds there, but again, we will work with applicants that get through the merit review, and work through each one of these budget line costs. Other items, miscellaneous. These are things that, if they really don't fit in one of these other categories, I would point out that line 15A, B, those are important costs, because these are really the costs that get to the activities within the Network Hub project, right? So you'll see that these categories, right, curricula costs, instructional delivery costs, work-based learning costs, and stipend costs, all of those correspond to allowable and required activities within the notice of funding award, right? And so we want you to identify, insert, what are the curriculum costs, right? Okay, well, I've got, this activity is going to do this component. I've got another activity that is going to accomplish another task, right? We want to see them under those buckets, right? So line 15A, and we maybe should have labeled it, but nevertheless, 15A is industry-focused training, okay? Break out your curriculum, instructional delivery, work-based learning, and stipend costs, all right? 15B, these are your supportive services, okay? These are your wraparound. So again, go back to the NOFO and identify those required activities around supportive services. We categorize those into 3 areas: wraparound services, student support services, transition support services. And again, you can insert columns rows underneath to show what all those costs are. So maybe you're doing some some assessments, and maybe you're doing some emergency bill pays, student support services. Maybe you've got tutors in there. Maybe you have books. Whatever the case may be, right? So go back to the NOFO. That provides you with some examples of those of the activities, and actually it's important. So I do want to just quickly take a look at that page. And again, I should say that this is primarily for the hub, the workforce hub. But give me a moment. And Okay, so back on page 6 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity outlines your supportive services, right? So that line, that budget line, 15B, directly related to these categories, right? You got your wraparound, student support, transition. So if you want to know where those activities should be classified, you know, go back to page 6 there. Okay, so that's, and then of course indirect costs there, and then there's a summary that it automatically, just like tab A, narrative summary is a tab that automatically calculates. Couple of other important things to note on this template, right? So we all know, right? This is where you input your costs, these line items, you know, 1A all the way through to the indirect costs, okay? Now, just some other notes on this form is that there are some other tabs that you have to work with, okay? Section A, again, autofill. This next tab, that's called the ICI, right? And hopefully you can see that at the bottom. ICI tab, you must complete. This is the indirect cost rate information tab, and this information must correspond with what you selected as part of your GATA registration, right? So we went all through those slides to say, hey, you registered with the state, and then you selected, you know, what type of indirect, how you're going to handle the indirect. And so that's where you select one of these options here, right? You're going to have a federal rate, you're going to have a negotiated state rate, and you would know, your fiscal person would know. So if you don't have either one of those, you don't check that box. If you want to use the 10% indirect de minimis rate, restricted rate is very uncommon. Your fiscal person would tell you, you know, if you have that. So that's, again, very uncommon. And then the other option, no reimbursement. Now, everything that I've told you is at a 30,000-foot level as it relates to indirect. There are nuances and exceptions and other, you know, provisos that I could go into. But that's like in indirect 201 and 301, and we're not going to talk about that today, okay? So if you have those, you can send us those questions, and again, if you get past the merit review, we'll work with you to make sure that it's all buttoned up. We do, let's see, so if you do have a rate, so if you do have a state or a federal rate, though, we want you to make sure that you include this, complete this box at the bottom, though. All right, so complete the ICI, and then the certification, this is very important, right? So the certification, this is where your organization should, or your chief financial officer or equivalent and your executive director or signator should sign this to basically say that they have reviewed this budget and they're in agreement, okay? Now, some tips for submission. You know, you can print this page off or have it, I guess you could drop the signature in, but just don't have, an administrative person just drop the signature in. Make sure that they review it, right? Some people will just print this page and then just scan it as a PDF, but as it relates to like your submission of this uniform budget, right? Send us the Excel template. Don't send us in PDF, because we really want to, again, if you pass merit review, we're going to have to work with you, and we probably might even go in here ourselves and say, okay, and highlight, make notes of areas like, okay, this has to get classified somewhere else, and so on and so forth. So, so again, that's kind of a very high-level crash course into the uniform budget template. I know that there's some other resources that we're going to talk about in the slide deck, to help you through those. I know that DCO actually also has some resources that could help you if you run into some trouble with this. But again, I know that this form, can seem overwhelming. It's not meant to, right? But again, once you do a few of these, you'll start to become more comfortable. Now, one final word, and this is really just relevant to the Workforce Hub program. You'll notice that for some of these budget line item categories, we have listed a 1A and a 1B, and a 2A and 2B, and 6A and 6B, and a 15A and a 15B. Why did we do that? The answer is that the state is pulling money out of two funding sources and two programs. So it is our goal to issue only one grant to your organization that includes money from the Workforce Hub program and also from the Barrier Reduction Fund program. So we've classified barrier reduction funds or made them synonymous with supportive services, right? That's why, again, we went back to page 6 of the NOFO to show you, okay, barrier reduction, supportive services, very, very important, right? So we understand that there may be some of your personnel that only work on the Workforce Hub side, and that there may be staff that are only focused on providing supportive services. So that's why we've broken this up. Now, a third case could be, well, in the Workforce Hub, in the supportive service, or maybe you're doing both. Well, in that case, you would go into line 1A for personnel, and you would say, okay, well, they do this 50% of their time to the hub, and then 50% of their time to the barrier reduction supportive services. Okay.
Hey, John,
so
can I interrupt you? Are you meaning
yeah,
to
please.
show your screen?
I
We're
am.
not seeing
Am I not
we're not
showing?
seeing your
Oh
screen.
no. Okay.
Thanks.
So all right. So thank you. So here and again, just so you can see, just line 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, right? So if you want, again, we put in, it's the manager. So instead of 100% time, we're going to say, all right, well, let's say 75% of the time really is going to be most focused on the Workforce Hub program elements, but maybe 25% of their time will be focused on administering supportive services, barrier reduction, right? So remember when we first started, total cost of executive director $80,000, right? So if we go back to the summary page, you'll see personnel includes line 1A and 1B, and you can see the breakout, right? And that, again, corresponds to where you enter that data. So again, only these tabs will allow you to enter the costs. If you try to enter those costs here, you're going to get that error message. Make sense? All right. I'm assuming the virtual head nods. Yes. Okay.
John,
so yes.
Can I ask one more question? So
Please.
again, to address the fact that we've got a lot of partner organizations, do all partners need to submit separate budgets, or can some of that be included in the main budget?
Yes, so that is a great question. So if you are a partner organization, the state is not going to necessarily see your sub-agreement budget, right? So I would advise, if I am like the lead organization, right? And again, going back to, we have 4 partners, right? I'm going to tell our partners, okay, let me get all your fiscal people and take this, and you guys put in what activities you're going to do, but categorize it using this same form, right? Maybe you even just, go old school and you print it off, and then you can like just kind of write out, okay, well, this is my total, right? And so that way, when you provide all of your background as a partner, right? So all 4 partners talk about, well, these are the things I'm going to do for the grant. I'm assuming like they're going to have, they're going to provide the top grant or the actual applicant with, narrative what they're going to do and a budget of what they're going to do. They should utilize the form to, help the primary applicant complete this, right? But bottom line, we do not want to see 5 budget forms when you submit your application. We want to see one comprehensive budget template that incorporates the activity of the applicant and all of its partners. And so that is one of the reasons why, in many cases, partners can be awarded funds under contractual services and subawards as one big lump, right? And that would be line 6A and 6B. So that's why we broke that out, because we know that some of the awards, some of the partners, hey, they're only going to do barrier reduction. Some of the partners may do both. And so you'd have to, again, split that up. But your subcontractors, again, are responsible for all of the requirements in the master agreement, right? So like your sub agreement, has to be compliant with our definitions, right? But we only want to see one roll-up form. That makes sense?
Yes, I think there's language in the budget that says if you're over $150,000, you should prepare a separate budget. But you're suggesting that should be all rolled up into.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to want to see it. I mean, we're going to want to see it. Obviously in your budget detail, the most important piece is within your budget narrative, right? Because that's where you're going to get scored the highest. I think the roll-up piece is most of those costs are going to be under contractual services.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. I know we only have about 25 more minutes. Happy to stay on a little longer if needed. So I want to switch now, if there aren't any other questions around the budget template. I want to just go into a little bit of a discussion about what makes up those costs, the numbers that you put into the budget templates and to your narrative, right? So these are some basics. So if you've done grants for a while, this should be familiar to you, right? So some of the core principles of budgeting is that you have to have, costs must be allowable. And again, they have to be necessary and reasonable for the grant, conform to any of the budget line definitions. You have to be consistent with the way that your organization utilizes those funds. So you can't just because you're getting government money doesn't mean like you can charge double for an activity. You can't say, well, I have a rate of this when I work for the government and a rate of that when I work for, or I'm funded through other sources. Key here is also that, that you have documentation to support those expenditures, right? The costs have to be reasonable. So I always say, It doesn't exceed what a normal or a prudent person, shouldn't say normal, but a prudent person, right? So I was thinking about it as like, okay, if it was my money, my checkbook, would I go and try to get the best deal? Absolutely. And that's our expectation for grantees as well, right? So going out and making sure that, you are ensuring, you're getting, the three quotes, you're following your procurement, you're making sure that, to the extent possible, that you negotiate with if it's appropriate with vendors, and look for discounts and all of those things that you would do, or most people would do with their own funds. And then allocable, right? So you have to make sure that your work is directed to the project. So I know some organizations that will apply will include, they may have other programs that they run, and that's great. But you have to make sure that you're allocating your time appropriately, and that you're charging your time off appropriately, and that, like the CJIP programs, aren't paying for other activities that you may be doing at that time. So again, we talked about direct and indirect costs, and we talked about the budget template. There is a section B for match. It is not required, so it is not included in the template. Again, we talked about that certification, which is absolutely key. And again, these are just some other things to remember, that most of those budget line items are standard across all agencies. I will say line 15A and 15B, and again, those were those program costs that are listed. The workforce hub costs, curriculum costs, all of those things very specific to this funding opportunity, as well as the barrier reduction funds. Very unique, and so that's why they're under line 15A and 15B. The rest of those budget lines, those are all standard lines across all programs. Indirect costs, we talked about, the importance of making that selection. So again, make a note of completing that ICI tab and being consistent with the indirect cost selection that you make when you register with the state. Okay, so these are just some of the highlighted grant requirements. On the DCEO or Department of Commerce website, we do have a section where you can actually see the current fiscal year grant agreement. Like I said, it's over 30 pages long, and so if if your organization is considering coming in, I would definitely encourage you to send that over if you've got some executive director or legal folks to get a sense of what are or what is your organization going to be required to do if you were awarded funds. And so this slide is just a highlight of some of the most important components just from a program management perspective. I would say, certainly all the requirements are important. They're there for a reason. But just know that all of these key elements are things that we as grant and program managers will highlight and will need to work with your grant contact and program administrators are, right? So we want to point out the audit requirements, our audit requirements to this award. You require fund accounting, fiscal reporting requirements, quarterly reports. We talked about, your responsibilities as a lead organization if you have sub-grantees or subcontracts. So if you're the grantee and you have 4 subcontractors, guess who's responsible? You are. Not all 4. As it relates to the state, you're responsible. So although we understand the complexity and how difficult it can be to work with subs, at the end of the day, if there's an issue, you are ultimately responsible. So you have oversight responsibilities as a primary applicant. We talked about the expenditure funds and the key components to look at as it relates to those costs against the grant. We'll talk about budget variations. Typically 10% within the line items are allowable. Reporting requirements, and of course, monitoring, right? Here's one of the biggest concerns that I have in our role as being responsible for grants is the amount of funds that are available for barrier reduction and supportive services are significant, right? It's a lot of activity. And so one of the key areas of risk is around those barrier reductions and making sure that that projects, organizations have great controls in place for those barrier reduction funds, right? Again, there has to be a balance. We know that providing supportive services and barrier reduction funds are essential, right, for successful projects. But we know that there could be a temptation out there to, potentially abuse it. And so that's where we have to have proactive procedures in place, monitoring procedures, and assess those risks up front. So we can document and make sure that all those funds are accounted and that they're going to the right place at the right time. All right, talked about how DCEO has the Uniform Grant Agreement. Here is the location to grab that. Again, there's multiple parts, over 30 pages, and this is how it's all kind of broken out. Uniform grant across all agencies. Then Department of Commerce has our information, and then finally we have our specific terms and conditions. Couple of the exhibits. So we will, based on the information that you provide, we will develop a project description, deliverables, and milestones. Your contact, obviously, and performance measures and standards to which you'll be held, and then any other conditions. And this is where, if there were risks, either through your internal control questionnaire, remember when you registered with the state, annual basis, right? Or when you do your ICQ on an annual basis, if there are, some issues to address or program concerns, we would note them in the agreement as well. So the last, one of the close to last slides are some of these other resources that we have. Talked about that the GATA site, or Grant Accountability Transparency Act site, grants.illinois.gov. This is the Department of Commerce site, has some additional resources for grantees, like some other topics that you may be interested, other training topics that you may be interested in. We have the DCEO CJA website, where you will be able to download all of the NOFO documents and information. And then some of the other documents that are referenced in the NOFO are listed here just for more guidance, right? Because we're working a lot with workforce. We have some other resource, some federal resources, Department of Labor, Illinois WorkNet, and finally Workforce GPS. That is like kind of a nationwide portal to help you with anything from program design all the way through monitoring, and kind of anything in between. So just some other resources for you all. Some of those were called out in the NOFO itself. And then here is my contact information. if you have any kind of follow-up questions on the administrative side. I know also that we have certainly the frequently asked questions that are updated or are being updated. And I think I do also just want to show you before we end. Actually, I want to go back and just reiterate, the requirements of what you should submit, right? Just because it's so critical, right? So again, look to that section of the NOFO, and again, uniform grant application, the budget template, conflict of interest disclosures, and mandatory disclosures, executive summary, right? So let's just show you what that, I showed you the application, showed you the budget template, the disclosures, and the conflict of interest and disclosures form. I'll show you what those look like. Again, they're pretty straightforward, and it's important. So this discloses if if you've had any issues with fraud violations, okay? And then the other form is this conflict of interest form, right? So if you have any real or apparent conflict of interest, absolutely important for you to list those out, and then we work with our legal office to make a determination around any, if a conflict exists, how might we mitigate that risk, and then take appropriate actions there. Let's see. So the other technical elements or submission requirements, then we're getting into your executive summary and your technical proposal. We talked about those four main components of the notice of funding opportunity, and then the attachments. Note that the attachments that are Word documents, right? You as an applicant are able to customize these attachments, and you should do that, right? So we've got the proposed work plan. So again, this is a starting point. You should customize to what is appropriate for your project. The outcomes, this is an essential table that outlines, kind of your bottom line activities and outcomes and impacts. So when we look at from a quantitative perspective, reviewers will absolutely go to this. This attachment would most likely be included or referenced into your grant agreement if you are awarded funding. Curriculum plan, again, this talks about we'd like to see what is your training going to look like, right? So again, these are starting points. If there's additional information that's appropriate or other things to reference, you have that ability to include that. And then your staffing plan. Again, this kind of outlines what are those requirements with the staffing plan, and then also to submit any additional information to demonstrate all of your great team's capacity, right? Including the resumes of staff, including partnership agreements and other memorandum of understanding, both from community partners and from other professional unions, industry association, employers, right? So I can tell you that, if you look at those requirements within the notice of funding opportunity, and those technical elements, right? Talks about your project plan and those overall outcomes, having that direct connection to, pathway into a union job or into a job with a company, and having those business relationships. So there's that pathway for participants to be successful and to get into jobs. That's a key component of that narrative, as you'll see. So that's where you would include all of those type of documents. Again, I think the NOFO speaks to providing partnership agreements as opposed to just kind of generalized letters of support as being more, competitive in your submission. So that kind of concludes the, kind of the overview of the requirements. I would say that most of this information, if not all, is included in the notice of funding opportunities or referenced therein. I would also just say, as a disclosure or disclaimer, right, that anything that may have been taken out of context, or if I misspoke or had an error in statement, just note that the NOFO is the document that is the is the guidance, right? So certainly anything that you have questions on, we can clarify. But I usually start by saying that NOFO and the written document is the primary source of information. The information we're providing you today is to supplement all of that and to provide a little bit more context around the information that is provided, and hopefully make some connections and help you through the forms. Because the bottom line is, and I believe this, that we don't want to disqualify applications on technicalities or because of difficulties with the forms, and have the forms and the process get in the way of qualified projects, right? But on the other hand, we do have to have the minimum requirements, and that's why, again, I'm just harping on that slide around what is required, so you don't get thrown out. Because I absolutely understand from a first-hand basis the amount of work that goes into developing these applications, and that's absolutely appreciated. And to have it potentially thrown out because of missing components is something that is very unfortunate for everybody, and we absolutely don't want to do it. So that is probably a great place to start, and then kind of open it up for any final questions.
John, before and please continue to put questions in the chat. I just put a few announcements in the chat, and I wanted to reiterate those. First of all, we had some questions about, will this recording be shared? Will the slides be shared? Yes. The Notice of Funding Opportunity web pages that I linked in the chat do have recordings of the previous webinars, and we'll be posting this one and the slides as well. So please feel free to go back and refer to those. We do have a few regional networking events. If you've attended a few, we've hosted a few throughout July, but I put a link to the registration form for that. Next week, we have one coming up in Peoria. We have one coming up in Chicago, in Joliet, Aurora area, as well as one in Carbondale. So we hope you'll attend. That's an opportunity to meet potential partners and other workforce organizations in your area, as well as some clean energy employers. So please consider attending that. And then finally, starting on the 31st of July, we'll be offering some office hours, which will be one-on-one technical support for grant applicants. And we hope, especially if you're a new applicant, if you haven't received funding before from DCEO, that you will sign up for a time, and we'll be meeting one-on-one to answer questions. about your proposals and give you a little bit of feedback. So those are just a few things coming up. And then finally, as John alluded to, we do have a frequently asked questions document that we are updating. It will be updated within the next couple days. And if you do have questions, please feel free to email them to ceo.cja@illinois.gov, and we will consider them and add them to the frequently asked questions as well. All right, I'm just looking at the chat to see if there are any questions. If you have questions now, please, you can unmute yourself and ask them or drop them in the chat.
Right. Or if I've lulled you into a coma with all of the fabulous administrative and technical requirements, we get it. There's a lot of information there, and and if you've already heard it, it's always good to have that reinforcement. It's fairly complicated stuff, and so again, we're here to help.
I do not see any questions.
Okay.
So
well, great. Well, there you go. So we've got 2 extra minutes for a Friday for everybody. So thank you all for your interest, and encourage you all to apply. Wish you all the best in that process, and we'll be talking with you down the line. Take care.